Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I'm Emily Jiang, and in today's talk, I'm going to talk about the two popular programming model for developing your microservices, MicroProfile and Spring. So I will spend some time to compare these two frameworks side by side. So I'm Emily Jiang. I work for IBM. I'm the Liberty Microservice Architect. So I work on MicroProfile and Open Liberty. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat window. And if I do not have enough time to answer your questions, please follow me on Twitter and or directly tweet the messages at my Twitter handle is Emily FH Jiang. So it's Spring has been around for probably more than 10 years. A MicroProfile is relatively new, so I will spend a couple of minutes to talk about the MicroProfile initiative. So MicroProfile has been around for 4 years, and recently is under Eclipse Foundation. Recently, it has set up its own kind of working group, so become the standard spec body. So it's, as you can see, MicroProfile is completely open source, and it has a very lightweight iterative process. So it's completely community driven. As you can see from the picture here is there's a lot of contributors from like vendors and also the individuals and etc. And there's about a dozen implementations, including Open Liberty, WebSphere Liberty, Quarkus, WorldFly, Payara, Apache Tommy, Helidon, Apache Launcher, Cumulus EE, Hammock, Piranha, and Apache Drone. So there's a lot of implementations to adopt this MicroProfile framework, which is the standard APIs for developing your microservices. So this is a quick timeline about releases of MicroProfile. So each year we aim for 3 releases. This year, because we spend a lot of time setting up the MicroProfile working group, then probably we just have 2 releases this year. So we are going to release MicroProfile 4.0 in like November time. So and rebase on the Jakarta EE8. So this is a quick a bird's eye view of what's in MicroProfile. So it has, as you can see here, is kind of color differently. So in dark color, this is 4 things directly adopt from Jakarta EE, CDI, JXRS, JSON-B, and JSON-P. And all these blue squares, they are all created under MicroProfile. So in each release, we release when I say the MicroProfile 4.0 release, that's including release all of these building blocks. And then on the right-hand side is standalone releases, because this is these are created recently. We want to get more feedback before we decide to merge with into the platform release. So including reactive stream operators, reactive messaging. This is for the reactive programming, reactive system development, and then also context propagation, GraphQL, and these are all being released this year or later last year. And then is to be releases. This is the LRA. So how to do the microservice transaction. So this is to be released once the MicroProfile working group is set up, probably towards the end of this year. Okay, so by now, probably you know a little bit about MicroProfile now. So now let's dig into the comparison bit to compare MicroProfile and Spring. Probably you I quickly went through the MicroProfile specifications, and you might already thought about the equivalent Spring like a framework. So in MicroProfile, like how to get started, we have start.microprofile.io, and Spring has a start.spring.io. And then the next thing is how to create a microservice. So in MicroProfile, we use the JAX-RS to directly create a RESTful service. And Spring, you use the Spring MVC. Dependency, MicroProfile use CDI, and Spring use IOCODI. So as you can see here, like and then how to do the REST client and JSON-B, JSON-P, and also reactive, and also the next category is how can you add the quality of services, like how can you configure MicroProfile, how do you configure microservices without rewriting your microservices. Basically is you deploy your microservice and you can configure in the environment. So like user configuration. In MicroProfile, you use MicroProfile config. In Spring, you use the Spring Boot config, and etc. And then how do you build a resilient microservices, and etc. And then towards the end is operation focus. How can you communicate with your cloud infrastructure? If something goes wrong, how can you work out what's the problem? So you use like, you need to correlate the trace ID. So you know each operation, how many microservices it was involved, and etc. So let's go into each individual like role and directly look at what's a difference and a similarity as well. So the first thing you can see in the start.microprofile.io, you can like create a Maven project and for a particular version of MicroProfile. And then you can choose, as I said, there's a dozen implementation of MicroProfile. Like for each, obviously, some of them are like some of them implement like a MicroProfile 3.2, some of them 3.3, because they all have a different release cadence or their own like timeline when to release a particular version, etc. Like in 3.3, you have 5 implementations to choose from. And in Spring, obviously, just have a Spring Boot version, and also you have like a group ID and artifact ID, and etc. So the next thing is like how can you create a RESTful microservice in MicroProfile? You use JAX-RS. You need 2 classes. One is the application. So application. The other one is JAX-RS resources. So you do a add path, produces this is the format, and then you can annotate add get, add put, and etc. etc. In Spring, you use the Spring Boot application, and also you have a REST controller, and then you can like specify the endpoint, and etc. So this is very comparable. And the next thing is like you create your microservice, and then you need to like make sure inside your microservice is kind of is really neatly designed, loosely coupled inside as well. So in MicroProfile, you use the CDI, so to directly inject some like inject directly inject object into this variable and etc. Because the CDI will automatically manage all the instances for you. You just say CDI give me an instance of this inventory refresh task, and you do not need to call it's like a constructor, and CDI automatically give you the instance. And in Spring, actually Spring also implement GSR 330, which is injection, and it does support at inject as well as at auto wired. So whenever people asking what's a CDI like, I will say in Spring you use auto wired. In CDI you use at inject. So both the CDI also implement GSR 330 built on top of GSR 330, and the Spring obviously is adopts GSR 330, but also kind of create its own other APIs like auto wired and etc. Yeah, to just emphasize this at inject and at auto wired both work in Spring as well. Both work in Spring, and the MicroProfile directly use the CDI, only support at inject. So the next thing is once you create microservices, you need to identify them and work out what they are capable of doing. So it's kind of documentation. So in MicroProfile, you use the MicroProfile Open API, which is directly the kind of Swagger API adoption. So it's once you know Swagger, and you will be able to understand the MicroProfile Open API. So here in MicroProfile Open API, it directly expose the endpoint / Open API. As you can see on the right hand side, is kind of exactly same as the Swagger output. And also in Open Liberty, we also adopt Swagger UI. So you can have / Open API / UI, you will get all the endpoint listed. So you can invoke the endpoint. So you can see here, it has API response and operation, all this annotation. You can directly add some comments there, description, and etc. So this is the kind of document API in Spring Boot. Looks like you set up a Spring Doc Open API, and then you can, it also adopts Swagger UI, is capable of doing Swagger UI as well. So you can add this dependency, and then it can automatically generate a doc using controller advice and response status as well. So like that. So this is pretty much equivalent. So next thing is once you create one microservice, and next thing is how can I connect these microservices together? So it's the kind of the connection aspect. So in MicroProfile, we use the MicroProfile REST client. So basically the backend, if a backend has an operation get all atoms, and is get operation produce a JSON payload, and then in the client you directly create an interface and lift this this service and with this same signature, and then you annotate at register REST client, and then you can directly inject that an instance of the inventory service client into a variable. You can directly call them the operation get all atoms there, and then you can use the MicroProfile config directly point to the backend. So similarly in Spring, you use the annotation at a fin client. So again, it's the same thing. Is lift the services, the backend the interface backend operation here, and you just annotate as a fin client, and then you can directly inject So here you use @inject at REST client. Here you just inject at auto-wired, inject this instance into a variable, and then you can call it. Obviously, later on, it has a configuration to point to the backend. So the next thing is I'm briefly talking about the payload. So the JSON payload is very popular in microservices. So obviously you will need some framework how to serialize into a JSON object and how to deserialize from a JSON object. So in MicroProfile, we use the JSON-B and JSON-P. So this is all framework and help you to create a JSON object or the deserialized JSON object to a particular object. So in Spring, actually it also supports JSON-B. However, JACON is more popular in Spring among Spring developers, or you can directly use JACON directly to the serialization. So this is a kind of another the demonstration how to use a microprofile JSON-B. So basically, when you create a microservice, you expose endpoint, get operation, and then JSON payload, and then you can directly say here instead of JSON object, you can directly say a particular object, like in this scenario, inventory list. And then you can use it as normal. You don't even know actually this will be a JSON object over the wire. The beauty is, so the implementation of microprofile the JAX-RS, and it directly use JSON-B in the background is directly serialized like an inventory list into a JSON object. Over the wire is deserialized into an inventory list. So the implementation of JSON-B automatically does this behind the scene. So you don't need to worry about much. So that's kind of pretty much imperative programming. So next thing I think since a few years ago, and there's some kind of use case and reactive programming is become popular. So in both MicroProfile and Spring, they both support reactive kind of the microservices as well. So in MicroProfile, we have MicroProfile reactive stream operators. So basically these operators is kind of manipulate reactive streams. So can do some like a flat map with that kind of the operation. And also we have a MicroProfile reactive messaging directly help you to publish a message and consume a message. So just use at incoming, at outgoing. So this is at incoming, this is kind of consumer. You create a consumer, just use annotation at incoming. And if you want to publish a message, you just use annotation at outgoing, publish to a particular channel. So it's you might ask, okay, where do I publish a message to? Actually, there's a lot connectors for you to choose from. So basically, it's you can plug in either configure to use Kafka, or you can configure to use active MQ or MQ or any kind of GMS capable kind of the messaging brokers, or use or plug in MQTT and etc. So there's a lot configuration, a lot of messaging broker you can connect with this channel. In Spring, and you can use like a Spring Reactor. So this is popular programming extension. And also you can use, it has like a focus on the Kafka as well. So you can directly use the Kafka API, or Spring Boot annotation to interact with Kafka streams. Like this one, you can inject a Kafka listener. You can not inject, sorry, this is create a consumer. So as a Kafka listener, and then here you can directly inject a Kafka template, and then you can publish message. So it's, the next thing is about the configure microservices. So the next section is about quality of services. So once you create a microservice, most of the time you need to configure the microservice. It's pretty much, I think, 99.99% time you should configure your microservice. However, once your microservice is uploaded in the cloud, you don't really want to change the configuration value and then republish your microservice. You just want to create a flexible microservice so you can configure your microservice in the environment. So this is the best practice. Also, this is one of the factor, the third factor in 12-factor app. By the way, I'm going to do another talk on Wednesday, same time as today, about live coding or 12-factor app. So I will use a MicroProfile and also Kubernetes to demonstrate how can you create a 12-factor microservices. A 12-factor app. So in MicroProfile, you use the MicroProfile configuration. So basically, you create the configure sources. Here, you just saying if you have an Elasticsearch underscore URL or index or doc types, etc., put in somewhere for example, in the MicroProfile -config.properties inside your application, or as an environment variable system property, or put anywhere, and then later on you can tell your microservice go that location to read this configurations. So it's and then you can use the inside your microservice. You can use the API. So configure provider .get config, and then your config .get value to look up a particular configuration property. Or alternatively, you can use the injection model. You can do a @inject, @configure property, and then you can do the which property you are interested, like Elasticsearch and score URL. And in Spring, so you can do, again, you create your configure source here, and then you can, here you can do a configuration properties, prefix, Elasticsearch. So this is kind of the structured configure source, and you can inject into the URL user. I would like to mention, actually, I heavily involved in the MicroProfile config. So in the upcoming MicroProfile config, we also support this annotation. We call it config properties, and also support a prefix. If however, for the config specification, is at the moment is still flat. Is you can specify this, and then later on you can just say add config properties prefix elastic. You can use the same thing, and then your URL index doc type will automatically be injected as well. So that's MicroProfile config. So the next thing is you want to create very resilient microservices. The thing is with microservices, they could call into some other microservices, and then the caller may not be able to fix the team manage the caller microservice may not be able to gain access to the backend microservices. So in this case, you need to build a very resilient caller. So no matter what a backend is behaving, your caller is always return a good response to your customers. So that this is why it's kind of very important to build a resilient microservice, and you need to cater for all kind of problems, and then it's your microservice behave all the time. Do not rely on anybody else. So in MicroProfile, you use a MicroProfile for tolerance. We have a retry, if it's a comeback with the error, you can directly retry. And then you can have a timeout. If it's a return, if you come back too slowly, and especially for some time critical microservices, you can plug in, you can annotate it with a timeout. So if it doesn't return with the 2 second, and you can get a timeout exception. And in that case, also you can plug in some fallback operations as well. And again, you can prevent from repeatable kind of errors. You can directly speed fast, fail fast. So use a circuit breaker. And also you can add another annotation bulkhead. So like a constraint how many thread can directly access this backend. And one more thing is the fallback. So basically it's kind of this is contingency plan. So basically if something is not working, you got error, if you have tried all kinds of things, you haven't retried and etc., couldn't fix the problem, and then you can plug in the fallback method and directly fall back into a different method to invoke that method instead. So like this one. So if this one return exception and being retried and exhausted retried, and then it will be able to call into this fallback method. And similarly in Spring, and then you can Spring adopts historics. So and then it's kind of create some annotations, historics command, and then you can also plug in some fallback method and etc. And also it supports circuit breaker as well. So one more thing to bear in mind, because historics is in the maintenance mode. So it's in MicroProfile, it actually is a implementation take care of all kind of implementation problems and look after all the kind of potential problems, even if it adopts a historics. If a historics goes on maintenance, it's its own responsibility to have to directly support it and etc. So as an end user, you don't need to worry about what underlying implementation is about. But in Spring, you need to add the dependency historics and etc. etc. So the next thing is how to create secure microservice. Actually, in microservice, most of the time, and most of the time you need to worry about most of the time or all the time, you need to worry about microservice security. So how can you create a secure microservice? Basically, you need to secure the backend. To how to secure the backend, in one operation. For example, in microservice, I have a HR kind of system, and there's many microservices work together to form this HR system. Actually, each individual microservice need to be secured, because you don't really want any arbitrary people to access other people's salary and etc. So how can you secure these microservices? So in MicroProfile, we directly adopt Jakarta EE security. So the kind of obviously here, rules allowed. So basically, it's a kind of rules allowed directly to say, okay, only the protected role allowed to access this endpoint, right? And then is kind of micro profile like a JWT directly adopt a JWT, but is add two more claims. One is UPN, the other one is groups. So in the token itself is directly the putting two more claims in. Is with that when the backend receive that token, JSON Web Token, JWT token, it can open it up. The implementer open it up, figure out which groups you belong to. For example, here is when the token comes in, the user request comes in, it opens up the JWT token, and then figure out, okay, it's protected, and then it's allowed to access this backend. Otherwise, it will get injected. And with the microprofile JWT specification, you can directly inject a JSON web token. Hello? Is that a question? Okay, probably not. So you can directly inject the JSON web token, and also you can inject a claim, a particular claim. In this one is if you put a claim custom value inside a JSON web token, and then you can in the backend when you get the JSON web token, and then you can inject into the variable custom. So in Spring, you have enable web security and enable RE source server and etc. So you can also inject in the JWT config into a variable. So the next thing is when you deploy your microservice into the cloud, and then is you were thinking about how can I interact with the cloud infrastructure. How can I tell the cloud infrastructure whether this microservice is ready to receive the request, or whether this microservice is going to die of starvation. So again, if you know Kubernetes has two endpoints. One is readiness probe, the other one is liveness probe. So in microprofile, it has corresponding operation, and it also exposes two endpoints, /health, /ready. You can directly use for readiness probe, and then /health, /live, you can use for liveness probe. So it's so here you can put in the algorithm here, and under what kind of circumstances you are ready. So the kind of popular algorithm for indicate whether you are ready is that if you need to access a database, you will do a talk into the database to see the database is responding or not. If it does, you are ready. If it doesn't, you had better not to say ready. For the liveness, obviously, if you nearly run to RAM properly, you say, okay, Kubernetes, please queue this pod, and I'm not doing well. In Spring, you use the Spring Boot actuator. So it's directly, you can use the directly implement health indicator and etc. to put the business logic here, not business logic, into the, algorithm, health check algorithm here. So the next thing is the metrics. For this metrics, like in Spring, in microprofile, we use microprofile metrics. So it directly is kind of the adopt job wizard. So, and also is create some annotations, timed content, metered, simply counted, and etc. So you can directly put an annotation against some operation. In Spring is use Spring actuator. So it has directly, both Spring and MicroProfile directly expose the endpoint slash metrics. So in Spring, you can like get the counter service and directly do a counted is similar to the counted, etc. The other thing I wanted to mention is in the past or currently, MicroProfile metrics is use job wizard, and also in next year also we also evaluate whether to use macrometer or not. So it's kind of very likely MicroProfile metrics will also adopt a macrometer, which is the framework Spring also used. So the next one is tracing. So basically is if you have an operation involved many microservices, like service A, service B, service C, if something goes wrong, you need to figure out which one is not working. So obviously, in order to make that kind of to work, you need to propagate a trace ID. So in MicroProfile, we use adopt open tracing. So adopt open tracing is uses this open tracing framework, and plus is a MicroProfile open tracing directly propagate trace ID and all the trace headers and etc. And then all the JAX-RS invocation automatically have the trace header and trace ID propagated. So without doing anything, you will get a trace ID propagated. Sorry, is that a question? Okay, so so it's in Spring you use Spring Cloud Sleuth is also is can get a trace automatically the trace information generated as well. So that's pretty much a big run through of the like a Spring and MicroProfile comparison. So the big takeaway is kind of they are very comparable. Developers should be free to choose what they prefer. Like a lot of the kind of the runtime support both Spring and MicroProfile, such as Liberty and also Quarkus as well. And Spring is popular because it has been around for many years. MicroProfile and JCON evolving very rapidly. So according to the QCon survey this year is kind of MicroProfile and JCON is kind of adoption rate went like up and up, is which is very interesting. So it's become is kind of quite popular nowadays. And like both Spring and MicroProfile kind of is a provided facility for developers build cloud native applications. So they are quite similar, but they are different as well. Like to list a few differences between these two framework, and MicroProfile is open source, directly driven by the community, also is a standard. So there's many implementations for it to choose from. And Spring also is open source, is driven by Pivotal. So it has its own APIs and etc. It's only Spring like Pivotal implement support this Spring kind of implementation. Having said that, Quarkus also support some of the Spring APIs, but does not use the Spring implementation. It has its own implementation. So Quarkus support both Spring and both the MicroProfile, full MicroProfile, and plus partial some Spring APIs. And in the MicroProfiles, customizes server configuration, and because the server runtime directly provide all the implementations, and so you don't need to put any more kind of the libraries and etc. in your POM if you are doing a Maven project, because the implementation provide all the implementation for you. So you only need to say which API you want to use. And the Spring, you can, is a kind of, you should know what you are doing. You add all the dependencies you want to use and etc. And the other thing is that like a MicroProfile implementation is a promote thin wall. On the Spring, you can use a fat jar or small jar and etc. So that's the kind of pretty much quick run through the kind of comparison. So this is a few useful links. So basically, the first one is directly blog about the experiment done by IBM to see how similar or different microservices, MicroProfile and Spring with. So this talk is directly based on the first experiment. So this talk is based on the real experiment to convert big microservice from Spring Framework to MicroProfile. And there's some other links. So also, let me quickly show the, actually it's 1 more minute. So it's here I use a Spring, I use a MicroProfile starter to directly create it the microservice. And you can see here, I can directly service A directly call into service B. And there's a health endpoint. And also you have API, open API, because I'm on Liberty, you have a UI as well. And also you have the metrics, can get all the metrics. So you can go to the start.microprofile.io to create your first MicroProfile equipped microservices. With that, we'll have a quick look, a few minutes to see the questions. Let me stop share.
Yes, hi, I've got a question concerning the previous or almost last sheet where you can see that the wall is quite small, you said. Is that due to the fact that the runtime or the third-party libraries which are used, for example, are resolved during runtime, or how do I have to understand that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like in the thin wall, like a model in the MicroProfile is in the microservice, you directly, let me show you directly. You only need to like add the dependency to say, okay, which version of MicroProfile you want. Just say 3.3 and POM provided, and then nothing else. You don't need to, and then obviously the which runtime you use, and then you can add a runtime like a plugin, nothing else. All the kind of like implementations are provided by the runtime. So your application don't need to worry about anything else. Oh, I'm not sharing, so sorry. So you can see here, like in the POM dependency, you just say the MicroProfile version and POM provided, and then it's kind of, in this case, is I use some vertex library. I add this one, and then apart from that, I don't need to mention any other like dependencies and etc. because the implementation of MicroProfile directly provided by the runtime you are using. Like in these circumstances, is Open Liberty, and then is Open Liberty handle all the implementation issue for you. So your application is very small. So you don't need to drag in any third-party libraries. Does that mention? I can answer your question.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot.
Thank
Maybe a second question. Um, yeah, well, I'm used to work with Spring, so I was just wondering, yeah, if there's any reason why, for example, if I have a project that starts from scratch, to use micro profiles. So, are there any advantages, big advantages, like, I don't know, performance or something that suggests to have a look at micro profile, or yeah, are there any advantages, like, I don't know.
Yeah, I think for the advantage, I can think this is a very popular advantages is one, the performance. So if you look at the Spring Boot and compare Spring Boot with other lightweight runtimes such as OpenLiberty, like Quarkus, you can see these lightweight OpenLiberty Quarkus are much faster, much more faster, much faster. The other thing is the kind of micro profile is hide all the complexity for you. So you only use the API. Is the other thing is this is based on the real kind of use case. I think as you said, convert from Spring to micro profile. There's a huge code reduction. This is based on the Greece Vodafone. It said it's 30% or something code reduction. So basically API is much simpler. So you can focus on your business logic. The third thing is once you use micro profile, because it's kind of open standard, is a standard API for developing microservices is a standard now. So it's a lot of companies support these APIs. So you are not into the vendor locking situation. So you can freely switch from one runtime to the other. If you one day your company want to have a different business partner and etc. So once you know micro profile, so you don't need to relearn a new framework.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So if there's a kind of, do I have any more time or I have to stop now? Okay, I let me answer one more question. So is there anything similar to Spring Cloud config available for micro profile? Yeah, so in micro profile we have a micro profile config. So I'm not too sure which aspect of Spring Cloud config, which functionality you are talking about. Please log on to the micro profile config to take a quick look. If some features are not there, please feel free to read the feature request. Yes, does micro profile has profiles like Spring. This is newly added. It's still fresh. It's to be released in November time. So it has actually personally. I did that. So I directly look at I think it's a quite popular Spring config feature. So we adopt and in micro profile config. Yeah, I think with that, I think let's conclude today's talk. Thank you very much for coming.